14 minutes before the ceremony, Madame Han climbed the private staircase of the Beck family estate, and every camera in the ballroom below turned to follow her, because everyone assumed she was going to get the bride. She was not. She doesn't belong here. The future daughter-in-law hissed to her own mother, watching the old woman's silhouette vanish up the marble steps. Someone should have stopped her at the gate. Nobody had stopped her, because Madame Han had personally written her name onto the guest list 3 weeks earlier, in ink, not pencil, so no assistant could quietly erase it. Near the back wall, half hidden by a column wrapped in white orchids, Nia Osi stood so still that a caterer nearly walked into her twice. She wore the kind of stillness people mistake for calm. It was not calm. It was restraint, sharpened over 5 years into something close to armor. She had told herself she came only to return an old photograph. Nothing more, nothing sentimental, nothing that could be misread. She had not expected Madame Han to remember her face after half a decade, let alone to cross an entire ballroom of Korea's wealthiest families just to press both of Nia's hands between her own and say quietly in accented English, "You came. Good. I was afraid you would not." Nia had not answered. She hadn't trusted her own voice yet. Now Madame Han was climbing those stairs, and something in the set of her shoulders told Nia this was not a woman fetching a shawl. The front doors of the estate would not open for another 11 minutes, but when they did, the man walking through them would still be wearing the black wool coat from an emergency meeting he'd left 40 minutes early, his jaw locked, his phone dead in his pocket, with absolutely no idea that his mother was about to hand his ex-fiancée's replacement and his family's darkest secret into the arms of the one woman he had spent 5 years pretending not to love. If you've ever been told a lie so convincing it rearranged your entire life around it, comment the city you're watching from and stay until the end, because what happens in the next 18 minutes will make you question every story you've ever been told about who the villain really is. 5 years earlier, Nia had not wanted anything complicated. She had grown up in South London, the daughter of a Ghanaian nurse and a father who died when she was 19, leaving behind nothing but a stack of unopened letters and a habit of kindness she'd inherited without meaning to. She studied languages because words were the one thing nobody could repossess. By 26, she had built a quiet, respected life in Seoul as a cultural liaison, the woman companies called when a merger needed more than a translator, when it needed someone who understood the silences between sentences. Her grandmother, Efua, had raised her for 3 years after her father's death, in a flat above a tailor's shop in Peckham. Efua mended wedding dresses for a living, English lace, Nigerian aso oke, whatever came through the door. And she used to say, while threading a needle by lamplight, "A torn seam is not a ruined dress, child. It is only a place where the dress remembers it was made by hands, not machines." Nia had kept that habit even after Efua passed. She still repaired her own clothes rather than replacing them, still believed damage and worth could sit in the same fabric. The single heirloom she owned was a small wooden thimble, worn smooth at the rim, that her grandmother had pressed into her palm on her deathbed with the words, "Mend what's yours. Never let anyone tell you it's already ruined." Nia carried it in her coat pocket the way other people carried photographs. Her family, an aunt mostly since her mother had returned to Accra, treated her success the way people treat a useful appliance, proud of it in public, quick to borrow against it in private. Every visit home ended with a request. Could she cover a cousin's tuition? Could she, just this once, front the deposit on a flat? Love in that house often arrived wearing the shape of an invoice. So when she met a quiet man named Jun at a used bookstore in Hongdae, a man who paid for her coffee without checking the price, who never once asked what she could do for him, the sheer novelty of it disarmed her more than his face did. For nearly a year, it was ordinary. Rain-soaked walks under one umbrella too small for 2 people. Instant noodles eaten straight from the pot at 2 in the morning, the steam fogging the single window of his rented studio. He never mentioned a last name, and she never asked, because in Seoul, that kind of privacy wasn't unusual for a man who claimed to work in international finance. He remembered small things, that she took her coffee with too much sugar and pretended she didn't, that she hummed under her breath when she was translating something difficult, that she flinched almost imperceptibly whenever anyone raised their voice near her. He never once flinched back. She believed him completely. She had no reason not to. There were three small strangenesses she noticed and forgave without examining too closely, the way people do when they've decided in advance to be happy. Once a car followed them 2 full blocks before turning off with no explanation, and he'd steered her into a bookstore with a hand at the small of her back that was gentler than his face, which had gone for just a moment, somewhere cold and calculating. Once, he paid for dinner in cash from an envelope thick enough that she'd joked about robbing a bank, and he'd laughed too quickly and changed the subject. And once, near the end, she found a second phone in his coat pocket while looking for a lighter, screen dark, case scuffed in a way his usual phone never was. She'd put it back without asking. She would spend 5 years wishing she hadn't. The night everything ended, she was waiting for him outside a restaurant when 3 black cars pulled up and men in suits got out carrying rifles instead of briefcases. Someone in the chaos called him by a name she had never heard, Young, the Quiet Wolf, and pointed at him with something between fear and reverence. She ran. She didn't stop running until she was on a plane back to London 3 days later, her phone destroyed, her bank account drained by June, a note left in her apartment that read only, "You were a mistake I enjoyed. Go home." She believed every word of it for 5 years. The truth was crueler and, in its own way, gentler than that note. Kang. No, not Kang. His name was Baek Tae-hyun, heir to a shipping and finance dynasty that hid, 3 layers beneath its glass towers, one of the most feared syndicates in the region. He had never lied about loving her. He had lied about everything else because loving her honestly was the one thing his world would have destroyed on sight. The night the men with rifles appeared, it wasn't Taehyun's enemies who found her first. It was his father's chief advisor, a soft-spoken man named Chairman O, who had built his entire career on knowing exactly which threads to pull to unravel a person quietly. He came to Taehyun with a photograph of Nia crossing a street in London 2 days after she fled, and a single sentence: "She is already being watched. Cut her loose publicly or bury her privately. Those are the only 2 doors." Taehyun chose the door that let her live. He forged the note. He drained the account himself and funneled the money into an anonymous trust that, 5 years later, would still be quietly paying down the mortgage on his aunt's house in Manchester. The same aunt who had once given Nia a spare key without asking questions. He never explained because an explanation would have required her to carry a secret capable of getting her killed. He became, in the years that followed, exactly what his enemies feared and his allies required. Colder, faster to give orders he used to hesitate over. When his father died of a stroke in a hospital hallway, Taehyun inherited 2 companies in the same afternoon. One that appeared on financial news and one that appeared nowhere at all. His advisors began speaking almost immediately of marriage as a merger strategy. The name that kept surfacing was Cho Yuri, daughter of a political dynasty with the kind of connections that made prosecutors develop sudden memory problems. Beautiful, composed, photographed constantly. Also, though almost no one alive knew it yet, entirely hollow underneath. Only Madame Han knew the full shape of what Yuri Cho actually was, because Madame Han had spent 4 decades learning how to read a ledger the way other women read a face. She found the first irregularity by accident, a charity gala fund for a children's hospital that had raised 11 million won and disbursed 600,000. She found the second on purpose, hiring an outside auditor under a false company name to trace Yuri's family accounts through Macau and back through a shell in Singapore. What she found there had nothing to do with vanity or greed. It had a name that made her hands go cold the first time she read it in an intelligence brief. A logistics network used, among other things, to move people who had not chosen to be moved. The marriage her son was about to enter was not a love match, and it was not even a simple power grab. It was an infiltration, engineered from outside the family to take control of Bayek assets from the inside, with Chairman O, the same man who had once torn Taehyun and Nia apart, quietly quarterbacking it from the shadows, exactly as he had quarterbacked the lie 5 years earlier. Madame Han discovered the second secret almost as an afterthought, buried in old correspondence she'd kept from her husband's final years. The betrayal that had sent a heartbroken young woman fleeing to London had never come from her son at all. Every document, every threat, every forged note bore Chairman O's fingerprints, disguised as her son's signature. Her son had lost the only woman he ever loved to protect her from a man who was now, 5 years later, standing in her own front hall arranging her son's wedding to a woman built entirely out of lies. Madame Han did not tell Taehyun what she knew, not yet. Instead, 3 weeks before the wedding, she did something that made her own household staff whisper behind their hands. She wrote Nia Ose's name onto the guest list, in ink. Officially, it was a courtesy, an old woman inviting an old friend of the family to witness a joyful day. Unofficially, it was a test she had designed with the precision of a woman who had once helped build an empire from nothing. Invite the truth into the room and watch which of the liars flinches first. Nia almost didn't come. She sat with the embossed invitation on her kitchen table in Seoul for 4 days, turning it over the way she used to turn over her grandmother's thimble. She had built a life she was proud of. Her foundation, a small nonprofit helping migrant women navigate Korea's Byzantine visa system, had grown from a folding table in a community center to an office with 11 staff and a waiting list 3 months long. She had a reputation for solving cases immigration lawyers called impossible. She had never married. She had never entirely stopped hearing his voice in certain kinds of rain. What finally decided her wasn't closure, and it wasn't hope. It was a woman named Grace Aji, one of her clients, who'd come to the office that week, clutching a stack of documents proving her ex-husband had forged an entire paper trail to steal her visa status and her savings in the same year. Watching Grace's hands shake as she laid out evidence of a lie that had run her whole life for a decade, Nia thought of the note in her old apartment, a mistake I enjoyed, and something in her chest went very quiet and very cold. She wasn't going to the wedding for Taehyun. She told herself that on the flight, on the taxi ride, on the walk up the long gravel drive lined with white orchids. She was going because 5 years of silence had earned her the right to look the truth in the eye one final time, whatever shape it turned out to have. She had not expected Madame Han to serve her tea with her own hands. She had not expected to be seated, deliberately, in a chair that placed her in direct sightline of the altar. She had certainly not expected the whispers that trailed her like smoke. His ex, the one who ran, probably here to beg, watched the bride throw her out herself. Each one landing somewhere just beneath her collarbone, where she'd learned over 5 years to let cruel words pass through without taking root. 3 times that morning, small things happened that she would only understand. Later were not small at all. A caterer adjusting a floral arrangement asked her, apropos of nothing, whether she'd ever traveled through Macau. A photographer took an unusually long time photographing the antique wedding dress VV displayed on its mannequin near the staircase before quietly texting someone and leaving through a side door. And Yuri Cho, passing close enough that her perfume lingered, murmured just for Nia to hear, "You should have stayed lost." Each moment was a Chekhov's gun loaded and left in plain sight. Nia noticed all 3. She said nothing. She had learned, in 5 years of watching desperate men lie to immigration officers, that the person who reveals what they've noticed too early always loses the room. Madame Han gave the family 3 chances that morning, though only she knew she was counting. The first was quiet. A private note sent to Chairman O the previous week, requesting he clarify certain irregularities in the wedding's financing before the ceremony. He replied with a single line, "Everything is in order, madam. Trust the process you built." A lie delivered in the tone of respect. The second was a direct question to Yuri Cho over breakfast 2 days before. "Tell me honestly, does love have any place at all in this marriage?" Yuri had smiled with her whole face and answered, "Of course, Oma," using the word for mother-in-law with a warmth so rehearsed it curdled in Madame Han's stomach. The third was the invitation itself, a door left open in ink for anyone in that house to walk through and tell the truth before the ceremony began. Nobody had. Not her son, buried in an emergency meeting he refused to explain. Not Yuri. Not Chairman O, who had simply smiled at the guest list and said nothing at all. 3 refusals. The noose in Madame Han's mind was fully tightened. So at 14 minutes before the ceremony, she climbed the private staircase, entered the room where the century-old wedding dress had hung in its glass case since before her own wedding day, and lifted it out with the same 2 hands that had once, decades earlier, lifted something far heavier out of a burning building in a country far from Korea. She carried it down the stairs herself, past the wedding planners, past the cameras hired to document a marriage that was never meant to happen, past her own future daughter-in-law, who went very pale very quickly. She walked directly to the back wall, to the woman standing near the orchid column, and placed the dress into Nia's trembling arms. "I have waited 5 years," Madame Han said, loudly enough for the room to hear every word, "to give this to the woman who actually belongs in this family." The ballroom went silent in the particular way that only true shock produces. No gasps, no murmurs, just several hundred people forgetting simultaneously how to breathe. Yuri Cho was the first to find her voice, and she used it like a weapon. "She seduced her way into this house," she said, loud enough to carry, pointing one manicured finger at Nia. "A foreign woman with nothing, chasing a family she has no right to. This is exactly the kind of desperation I warned you about, Uma." Nia did not raise her voice. She had learned, across 100 immigration hearings, exactly what silence could do to a room that expected shouting. She simply looked at Yuri and said, "I haven't asked you for anything, not once, which is more than I can say for you." Before Yuri could answer, the front doors of the estate opened and Baek Tae-hyun walked in, still wearing his coat from the emergency meeting, and stopped dead in the entrance of a room that made no sense to him at all. His mother, his lost love, a century-old dress, and his fiancée screaming into a silence nobody else was filling. What happened next took less than 4 minutes, though everyone in that ballroom would describe it afterward as though it had lasted an hour. The side doors burst open, not guests. 6 men in dark tactical vests moved through the crowd with the calm, terrible efficiency of people who had rehearsed this. They weren't after jewelry, and they weren't after the safe in Taehyun's study. Their leader went straight for the dress in Naya's arms, seized a fold of the underskirt, and tore. Sewn into the lining, wrapped twice in oiled cloth, was a leather journal the size of a prayer book, its spine cracked from age, its pages the color of weak tea. Bodyguards moved. Someone fired a shot into the chandelier, sending crystal raining down like ice. Guests screamed and scattered toward the exits in a crush of silk and panic. And Nia, who had spent 3 years running emergency evacuation drills for a foundation that operated in buildings with exactly 1 fire exit, did not run. She grabbed the elderly guest beside her, a diplomat's wife frozen in terror, and steered her bodily toward the service corridor. She scooped up a crying flower girl no older than 6 and carried her the same way, shouting directions in 3 languages to guests who understood none of them but followed the sound of a calm voice anyway. She was still doing it when the gunfire stopped, her dress torn at the hem, her hands steady in a way that made Tae-hyun, pressed against a pillar with his mother shielded behind him, stare at her like he was seeing a photograph he'd kept for 5 years, suddenly step off the page and start breathing. The attackers fled with nothing. The journal never left the mansion, because in the chaos, it was Madame Han, 71 years old, moving faster than anyone in that room, believed she could, who had caught it from the floor where it fell and pressed it flat against her chest until the shooting stopped. In the wreckage-strewn silence afterward, with paramedics tending minor cuts and half the wedding's flower arrangements crushed underfoot, Madame Han finally said the words she had been carrying for 5 years. "He never betrayed you," she said to Naya, her voice raw. "The note, the stolen money, all of it was built by one man to save your life by ending what you had. My son has spent 5 years hating himself for a lie someone else told." Naya felt the ground tilt. 5 years of careful, deliberate healing, of telling herself she'd loved a man who never existed, collapsed in the space of one sentence. She looked at Tae-hyun, who had crossed the room without either of them noticing, and saw in his face the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent half a decade proving to himself that silence was mercy. "You could have told me," she said, not a question, barely even an accusation. Just the truest thing she had left. "Telling you would have painted a target on you that never came off," he said quietly. "I chose the lie that let you live over the truth that might have gotten you killed. I would make the same choice again. I would hate myself for it again, too." Madame Han did not let the moment linger into sentimentality, because she understood better than anyone in that room that the danger hadn't passed. It had only been named. She opened the journal with hands that had waited decades to do it, and told them what neither of them yet knew. The man behind the forged note, behind the fake evidence, behind this marriage built to hollow out an empire from the inside, was the same man who had spent 30 years standing at her husband's elbow, smiling, indispensable, trusted completely. Chairman O. And the reason he wanted this particular journal so badly, she said, had nothing to do with Nia or Tae-hyun, or even the marriage at all. It had to do with a truth about herself she had buried even deeper than the journal's hiding place, one she would only reveal once they were somewhere safer than a mansion with a shattered chandelier and an unaccounted-for gunman's escape route. The days that followed scattered the guilty like startled birds. Yuri Cho's father, confronted by federal investigators with the financial trail Madame Han had spent months assembling, tried denial first, his lawyers calling it a misunderstanding of complex offshore structures, before the sheer weight of documentation collapsed the story into silence. Yuri herself vanished from public life within a week, her engagement dissolved, her name quietly scrubbed from 3 separate charity boards that could no longer afford the association. Chairman O did not confess. Men who have spent 30 years perfecting deniability rarely do. But when Madame Han finally opened the journal fully, in a locked room with only her son and a trembling but resolute Nia present, its pages revealed something that stripped away his deniability piece by piece. Decades of transactions, names, dates, and a network of complicity stretching from Seoul to Macau to a shipping route through Singapore that had nothing to do with cargo and everything to do with the trafficking network Yuri's family fortune was actually built on. The journal had not been written by some distant, faceless founder of the Baek dynasty. It had been written by Madame Han herself, 40 years earlier, not as her husband's wife, but as the architect who had built the financial backbone of the family's survival during a war that had nearly erased them entirely. She had buried that identity the day her husband was named head of the family, because the world she operated in had no room, then for the truth that the empire's real strategist wore a woman's name. Chairman O has spent 30 years terrified of what happens if the world learns his mentor was never truly the one steering the ship, she told them. This marriage was never about your father's legacy, Tae-hyun. It was about controlling what happens when mine finally comes to light. There was one more piece, and it was the one that broke something open in Nia's chest that she hadn't known was still closed. Decades before either of them were born, in a covert evacuation during a regional conflict that history books mentioned only in passing, a young Ghanaian aid worker had pulled an injured, unnamed Korean woman out of a collapsing building and refused to leave until she was safely on a truck bound for the coast. That aid worker's name, recorded in a faded ledger Madame Han had kept for 50 years, was Kwame Ose, Nia's grandfather. "I did not choose you for my son because he loved you," Madame Han said, taking both of Nia's hands the way she had at the start of that terrible, transformative day. "I chose to let this family finally do right by yours, because a debt 50 years old was never truly paid, and I have spent my whole life believing a family that forgets its debts deserves to lose everything it has." The final confrontation happened not at the mansion but at an abandoned shipyard outside Incheon, where Chairman O cornered, his network collapsing hour by hour as international authorities moved on accounts Madame Han had spent months mapping, made one last attempt to seize control, luring Tae-hyun and Nia there under the pretense of a private negotiation. He did not raise his voice. Men like him rarely needed to. "You think exposing me saves your empire?" he said, standing in a pool of sodium light between rusted cargo containers, his voice as unhurried as it had been 30 years earlier when he first taught a teenage Tae-hyun how to read a balance sheet. I built half of what your family calls legitimate business. Without me, there is no baek name left to protect. For a moment, something almost like sympathy passed through Tae-hyun, the memory of a man who had taught him to tie a proper knot in a necktie the week his father buried himself in grief instead of parenting, who had sat with him through 2 funerals and called him son more often than his own father had. It was the one moment the story allowed the audience to understand why so many people had trusted this man for 3 decades. Then Tae-hyun remembered the note forged in his own handwriting, the 5 stolen years, and the sympathy passed as quickly as it had come. You taught me that loyalty without honesty is just control wearing a nicer word, Tae-hyun said. I finally believe you meant it, just not the way you meant it to be believed. There won't be a baek name worth protecting if it's built on what you built it with. Tae-hyun answered. It was Nia who ended it, not with a weapon because she had none, but with the one thing 5 years of careful, patient work had taught her better than almost anyone alive: how to make the truth undeniable in front of witnesses who could not later claim ignorance. She had spent the drive to the shipyard on the phone with Grace Ajay's immigration lawyer, forwarding encrypted copies of the journal's most damning pages to 3 international regulatory bodies simultaneously, with time-stamped confirmation of receipt. It's already sent, she told Chairman O, her voice perfectly level. Whatever happens here changes nothing about what happens next. The only thing left for you to decide is whether you walk out of this shipyard or whether they carry you out. For the first time in 30 years, Chairman O had no answer prepared. He did not apologize. Men who spend decades perfecting control rarely manage grace even in defeat. But he did, in the end, walk, flanked by the same regulatory investigators Nia had alerted, his network of loyalists melting away with the specific, cowardly speed of people who had only ever been loyal to his winning. In the weeks that followed, the Baek family did something almost no one in that world believed possible. They dismantled, publicly and irreversibly, the criminal architecture Chairman O had spent decades hiding beneath legitimate shipping contracts. Executives who had built careers on looking away resigned in a slow, humiliated procession, their statements of personal reasons fooling no one who read the financial press that season. Politicians who had taken money from Yuri's family network found their names printed in headlines they could not buy their way out of, their aides scrubbing years of photographs from public archives too slowly to matter. Tae-hyun spent those weeks in boardrooms instead of ballrooms, unwinding contracts his father and grandfather had signed with men who should never have been trusted, replacing them one by one with agreements that could survive daylight. It cost the company nearly a third of its declared value in a single quarter. He signed the paperwork anyway, in front of a board that had spent 30 years deferring to Chairman O's judgment and now watched in uneasy silence as the son they'd underestimated proved harder to manipulate than the father had ever been. Yuri's mother tried bargaining next, once denial had failed her husband, offering testimony against Chairman O in exchange for her daughter's name being kept out of the coming trials. Madame Han, who had spent a lifetime learning exactly which mercies were worth extending, agreed to the bargain but not the silence. Yuri's name appeared in the filings regardless, smaller than her father's, but present, because Madame Han did not believe in protecting anyone from the consequences of what they'd chosen, even a young woman who had perhaps been raised into a role as thoroughly as Nia had been raised out of expecting one. Madame Han did not gloat, and she did not disappear into quiet retirement either. She testified when asked, with the same steady voice she'd used to place a dress into a stranger's arms in front of 300 witnesses. She told a reporter, in the one interview she agreed to give, that she had spent 40 years letting the world believe a man had built what a woman actually built, and that the only thing she regretted was how long it had taken her to stop being afraid of the truth. Naya went home to London for 6 weeks, not to run this time, but because Grace Ajay's case had finally reached its hearing, and some promises matter more than any wedding. She sat in the back of that courtroom and watched a woman get her stolen years acknowledged in writing, and she understood, finally, the shape of the thing her grandmother had tried to teach her with a needle and thread. That a life torn open is not the same as a life ruined, provided someone stays to mend it. She came back to Seoul in early spring, months later, in a small private ceremony that made no headlines because Madame Han had specifically ensured it wouldn't. The same silk box that had once held the century-old wedding dress was opened again. This time in a garden behind the estate, with no reporters, no rival families, no cameras hunting for a scandal. The dress itself had been repaired rather than replaced. The tear where the journal had been hidden was visible if you knew to look for it, a line of careful, deliberate stitching, slightly different in color from the original fabric, exactly the kind of mend Naya's grandmother used to make. Nia had insisted on doing it herself. A torn seam isn't a ruined dress, she told Madame Han, threading the needle by afternoon light in a room full of people who actually loved her. It's only a place where it remembers it was made by hands, not machines. Madame Han placed the dress into Nia's arms a second time, this time not as a test, not as a trap, not as a message to a room full of strangers, but simply as a promise, finally allowed to be ordinary. Taehyun did not wait for tradition to tell him when to kneel. He did it because he finally had a question he was allowed to ask out loud, in a world no longer built on lies he had to protect her from. Nia was smiling before he finished the sentence, which was, in the end, the only answer either of them needed. Outside, the first rain of spring began to fall over Seoul, the same rain that had once brought two strangers together in a used bookstore, now falling over two people who had lost each other to someone else's lies and found their way back by insisting again and again on the truth. So here's what this story leaves you with. If the people who claim to love you keep asking you to shrink, and the people who barely know you keep asking you to stay whole, which ones do you actually let define your worth? And when you finally learn the lie that broke your heart wasn't even told by the person you blame for 5 years, do you let that truth free you, or do you let it become one more thing you carry? Tell me your city, and tell me honestly and stay close, because the next story we tell together starts with a locked door. Nobody in that family wanted opened. Like this if the mended dress meant something to you, and follow for the next one, because the strongest families, in the end, are never the ones with nothing broken in them. They're the ones who choose, every time, to keep mending.